Hi there, I'm Danny Thompson. Welcome to my lair. A place full of twisted dreams and sweet nightmares. And don't let the bedbugs bite.
Thank you, Danny. We are Sweet Nightmares. This is A View from the Bar. I am Troy, and
I am John.
And he is John. And I was just going to start off, actually, because, that is Danny Thompson in the intro there. She's not just some random hot chick off the internet that we've put on there for clickbait reasons. Danny is actually part of the Sweet Nightmares team. She is a very multi-talented individual, and you almost certainly will be seeing content from her in these videos. So please don't switch off as soon as you see our ugly mugs.
Well, yeah. Well, yeah. Or maybe just turn the video off and just have audio. So
maybe that. So as I say, this is A View from the Bar. So first of all, let's talk about our booze. What are you on today, John?
Well, unfortunately, I've been working all day, and I rushed out to the local co-op, and the only decent thing they had was the same thing I was drinking last week, which is just a Pinot Grigio wine. It's not particularly exciting, but I'm sure Troy is going to introduce something which is incredibly exciting, which will make my crappy Pinot Grigio, just pale in
insignificance.
Yeah.
Don't put down the Pinot Grigio. Don't put it down. Don't do that to yourself.
Is that a mouth to war there? You picking a fight? Sorry.
It's good that you're coming out about these things in public now.
Yeah.
So I went for, I looked for a craft beer with death in the title. I've got the T-shirt on, so I was going to, more about that in a sec. And I was looking for a craft beer that had something to do with death in the title, and I couldn't find one. And then I found this bad boy, a vulgar display of flower by Equilibrium Brewery, which is it's a double IPA. It's an American import. It's delicious. It's 8.5%. And obviously, as soon as I saw vulgar display of flower, which is an obvious Pantera reference, I had to buy it. But it is actually really good. It's delicious.
Yeah.
And because it's 8.5%, I'll probably be hammered by the end.
I think you'll be hammered halfway through. So
yeah, probably. The thing with these, like the Dippers and the New England IPAs, I find is that although they tend to be strong, they're usually above, the New England IPAs are usually around 6 or 7, and the Dippers are like 8 upwards. I've seen them as high as 10. Which is like Imperial Stout strength. Now, an Imperial Stout, you wouldn't drink pints of that unless you're an absolute lunatic. Whereas with this stuff, you absolutely can drink pints of it. And after you've quaffed the first pint, you would happily go back for more. And then probably within an hour, everything will be blackout, I reckon. So they're dangerously quaffable for the strength that they come in, but they are delicious.
Sorry, quaff. So is having a beard mean that you have to use the phrase quaff? just wondering that. I'm pretty sure our audience turned off after quaff. So
quaff, yeah. Is that...
And then another audience which has tagged it as quaff as logged in. So.
Did I go all Oz Clarke there for a moment? I didn't start talking about floral high notes, did I?
Well, it is called vulgar display of flowers, so I think that's pretty close. So I wonder actually what Pantera would think of that anyway.
Yeah,
so
I wonder if Anselmo drinks it or not. It's be interesting to know.
Yeah.
Maybe he does, and maybe that's why he went on his racist rant. I don't know.
Yeah, could be. Well, we'll find out in about 20 minutes' time when Troy goes on his... and we're pulled from the YouTube. So
yeah.
Anyway.
Okay, so the topic today is death, which is very depressing.
Yeah, well, yeah.
So so let me explain that a little bit more. So a slight departure from talking about films. We're talking about comic books today. This time last year was Day of Dredd. I think the official date was 7th of September, something like that. But I believe that whole month was Dredd-related content. Dredd is in Judge Dredd, the 2000 AD comic book character, who has been featured in a couple of films as well. And as because of COVID and everything else, I don't think anything's happening this year. So instead of doing Day of Dredd, we thought we'd do Day of Death. In particular, Judge Death Lives, which is the story that's in... well, it was originally printed in the weekly comics, but it's in the Judge Dredd Complete Case Files number 5, which is probably a good starting point for most people if you want to get into Dredd. Don't start at 1, because most of the stories are rubbish. There's a reason for that. They were originally written for children, and because Dredd's been around for so long, like 50 years now or something, he's grown with his audience. So the current content is a lot more adult orientated, whereas the early stuff was a little bit more juvenile. It was written specifically for 8 to 13-year-olds. So yeah, don't start at 1. You'll be massively disappointed. Start at number 5, and then you get one of the best stories featuring Judge Death and Judge Anderson, and you also get the Apocalypse War in there as well, which is one of the best epic stories ever told. So, enough waffling from me, John. So tell me a little bit, because I know you've just read this or reread this recently, so tell me what your thoughts on it were.
So I have to say that I haven't been rereading. So obviously when I was young, I read 2000 AD pretty much all the time, and was a massive fan. But that was a long time ago, and I haven't reread it as much as you have, and so it's been quite interesting hearing you sort of tell me about stuff that back in the day, and it's suddenly coming back to me and all that kind of thing. So rereading this one, it was so it did take me back quite a bit, and it just reminded me firstly just of how awesome Brian Bolland, his artwork is. How, you know, just and some of like the weird kind of traits that we'll probably talk about in a bit that you kind of see, and the way he does certain things, and some of the I think like we probably will say is probably one of the most iconic images of Dredd. Even to the point when I was rereading it, we'll talk about it in a bit, but it kind of also plays into possibly something that happened in one of the Lord of the Rings movies right at the end, which I was, weirdly jumped out to me. It's just like, is that where they got that from?
That's not the first time it's happened in Dredd. In the first ever Dredd mega epic, which is the Cursed Earth, which is basically just he goes from one city to the next and goes on a bunch of adventures. So there's a bunch of like mini stories within one long story. And in one of them, he comes across a place where there's all these genetically engineered dinosaurs. And that predates the Jurassic Park book. So Pat Mills wrote that one, I think. So Pat Mills in 2000 AD actually did Jurassic Park before Jurassic Park. Who wrote it? Was that Crichton?
Brian? Yeah, it's Michael Crichton. Yeah.
If not, we can flash it up on the screen.
Yeah.
Do that thing.
We part of it, as the disclaimer said, is our research is impeccable. So
always impeccable, always. And it gets better the more we drink.
Yeah, exactly. But so well, I don't doubt. I mean, you, in principle, most of anything as references stuff that's happened before and has come through as stories. So, but yeah, that was just a minor thing that kind of jumped out, and it was quite a big thing in the. We'll talk about it when we get to it a little bit.
Yeah, and of course the other thing with Judge Dredd is that it doesn't just like preempt movies. It's preempted not so much with this story, but in other stories they've preempted like all of history. Like John Wagner basically wrote 2020. Literally everything that's happened, that's been happening in the news over the last 6 to 8 months, has already been in a Judge Dredd story in some form or other. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, totally. Sadly, as well. So.
Yeah. So I just wanted to mention the credits for the story. So you mentioned Brian Bolland, the artist, and it is some of the most beautiful comic book art ever. I'm looking down because I've got the physical copy here. And like, to me, Brian Bolland, like, because I write comic scripts as well myself, and in my mind's eye, when I'm writing a script, I'm writing it for Brian Bolland. Like, I'm trying to visualize how Brian Bolland would draw it. I don't know. It's just kind of, to me, he's like the archetypal comic book art, especially his black and white work. When you see his inked work like this, it's just beautiful. It doesn't have quite the same impact, I don't think, when it's coloured. The script is by T.B. Grover. Now, T.B. Grover is a pseudonym, and that was actually the writing team of John Wagner and Alan Grant. They were a very successful writing team for about 20 years, I think. And they didn't just write for 2000 AD, because obviously they wrote a lot of the early Dredds, sort of the golden era, early to mid 80s era of Judge Dredd. They wrote most of that as a team. They also wrote most of the Strontium Dogs stories, excuse me, and I think also the Robo Hunter stories as well. And and Ace Trucking Co. I think that was either John Wagner on his own, or it was the pair of them in collaboration. So a lot of the best stuff from that early to mid 80s era was written by the team of Wagner and Grant, and they also had quite an extensive run on Detective Comics, writing Batman as well in the early days. Okay. So, they get around.
Yeah.
And then lettering by Tom Frame. I mean, Tom Frame is a legend, and this was back in the days before everything was digital. So, it's handwritten lettering. All the bubbles and speech balloons and captions and what have you, all handwritten by Tom Frame, I believe. I don't think they used like a printing typeset or anything like that.
That'd be interesting to know. I mean, like Troy says, I mean, he writes comics and stuff, and we've done some comics together, and we've just recently done one called Satori, based on a short film that a friend of mine made, and I sort of did the lettering, and it was hard enough.
Link in the description down below, or maybe we can put it up there somewhere.
Yeah, it'll be somewhere floating around. So, but it was hard enough doing it without, having the capability to quickly move this and erase that and God knows what else. So I'm always totally in awe of this kind of notion of things, people being able to do this stuff before digital art and being able to undo. That's kind of the thing to me. It's just, I can undo my crappy drawings and I can undo my crappy text. So
but the Satori one is slightly different, because it's not a drawn comic, is it? It's a photo comic.
See, basically it's literally taking the frames from the short film and that essentially is the artwork. Now, admittedly, we've shot, and a lot of it is CGI and stuff, and visual effects. So in some ways we have kind of created it, but in other ways it's quite a nice, interesting way. Anyway, there'll be there's a download link that we'll put there, so you can download it and check it out. So
So with T.B. Grover, Wagner and Grant, so tonally the story in this strip is fairly light, because it is the early 80s. It is still written for, it's 2000 AD was very much a boys comic then, so there's that sort of 8 to 13-year-old demographic. So it's evident in the writing, although it's not juvenile and childish or anything like that. It doesn't have any real heaviness to the storytelling, and there's quite a lot of light-heartedness in it. So, like, on the first page, there was a gag that actually made me laugh out loud when I reread it the other night, and it's just the balloon that says, "Over here we have the uniform of Judge Hurst, the inventor of the flesh disintegrator. He will be remembered."
Yeah. Yeah, that's brilliant.
That's just classic them. So there's lots of little comedic moments like that in there.
Yeah. And
And
I think
obviously, go on.
I was just going to say, I think that's kind of tonally, it's kind of, I hate to reference this in some ways, but the Stallone Judge Dredd film,
Mm,
or more Hollywood style, it's kind of got a little bit of that air where there's
mm,
quipping is going on,
yeah,
not quaffing, but quipping.
yeah.
And
It's quite
basically,
quippable,
yeah,
whereas this is quaffable.
exactly. It's kind of yeah. You're right. It is. It's, there is obviously some depth, and there is depth to it, and a dark tone to it in some respects, but at the same time, and especially when you get to the end, it's kind of has a kind of Hollywood-esque tone to it in a
Mm,
way. I would say it definitely
yeah,
runs almost like a Hollywood film,
yeah, yeah, it does. And
which
yeah,
isn't
you saying
bad.
about the '95 Judge Dredd film, yeah, the tone of that, like didn't get the character at all, and they completely fucked it up, in my opinion. It had the right visuals. I thought the city and the cursed earth looked amazing, but everything else about the film was garbage. But it was almost like they'd read a handful of the Daily Star strips. Do you remember we used to get like the 4-panel Judge Dredd strips or whatever it was, 4 or 8 panels, like just a newspaper strip, and they were always like super quick and super light-hearted.
Yeah,
It's like they read a handful of those and then thought they knew what Dredd was about.
yeah.
So the story starts. Spoilers if you haven't read it. So the story starts. Judge Anderson is in. She's entombed or encased in a block of Boeing, which is the miracle, as it keeps telling you throughout the script. Boeing, the miracle plastic, and so this is the second part. This is the second time we've seen Judge Anderson, and the second time we've seen Judge Death. The previous Judge Death story was only a short 4 or 5-parter, and that's when they introduced Judge Anderson. And I get the feeling that they didn't realise, when I say they, like the writers, John Wagner and Alan Grant, didn't realise what they were working with or what they had created. And I think it was simply because of Bolland's artwork that everyone fell in love with Judge Anderson, because he drew her to look like Debbie Harry, who was kind of the hot property of the day. So every teenage boy reading 2000 AD saw the embodiment of Debbie Harry in those pages and completely fell in love with Judge Anderson. And then the way he drew Judge Death, which is just amazing, and made those two characters instantly iconic. So they had to bring them back and do a slightly bigger story, and then they've come back multiple times since here. So in the story, this guy has come in and he's under some sort of mind control, and he breaks Anderson out, and then Judge Death's spirit comes out of her and out of the Boeing and kind of attaches itself to the bloke. So what do you think of that, like the idea of like the floating death head, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I was going to quickly say is it's quite
Yeah.
interesting, like in terms of comics, films, etc.,
Mm.
is the use of internal monologue going on in the panels, almost through "God, don't let anything go wrong now. It's cracking, smoke," kind of thing. It's quite interesting that that's in there to me, because that's the very antithesis of like kind of with filmmaking and stuff like that, is that show don't tell, whereas obviously with this, that's one thing. So it's quite just an interesting point to me, or maybe not that.
And that is a very interesting point, and that was very much the writing style of the time. I remember when I first started reading comics was in probably the late 70s or very early 80s, and it was British war comics like Battle.
Oh, I'm hit.
Yeah. So it'd be like, oh no, Jerry's run behind the tree, I must shoot him. And it's like, and I always thought as a kid reading it, like, you don't need to tell me that, because the artist has just done a fabulous job of depicting that. So you don't need to tell me that. And what we've actually seen with comics, sort of sometime around the mid-80s, there was a shift. And I think it was probably the American writer Frank Miller, in combination with the legendary Alan Moore, that kind of brought comics into this. They went from being comics to graphic novels, and they had a much more adult tone to them, and you saw these like thought bubbles disappear. And the internal monologue was always done in captions, and it was much more. It was just much better written. It wasn't just like it wasn't used solely for exposition.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's just quite interesting seeing it, and if you analyze it, especially if you like we've been doing, like I say, our own stuff. It's quite interesting that you don't really sometimes notice it until you're having to do it yourself, and it's just like, oh, actually, that's nonsense. That what we're trying to do is try and tell a story by people telling us what they're doing, type thing. But in terms of the floating head, I mean, I think he's quite cool. I quite like the text as well. Again, going back to this type of thing.
Sorry, but yeah, an interesting use. So, giving props to Tom Frame, the letterer here. Interesting use of lettering and the speech bubble style used by Judge Death. The way the letters are almost dripping, it gives you the impression you can almost hear his voice in your head when you're reading it.
Yeah, totally. Actually, just as a slightly side interesting note, I just thinking about is if you was, and we'll probably be discussing this a bit further on, if you was to do a film version or an animated version or whatever, is how does Judge Death talk? Because he's got this massive set of teeth and that, and I can imagine it could be quite difficult to not make it comical.
Yeah.
And to actually make it quite terrifying. I think there's actually
the voice would be done by Andy Serkis, wouldn't it?
Well, I don't doubt it. He's got the monopoly on all this stuff, or not. It could be a female Judge Death. Just saying.
Yeah, if it was a Marvel film.
All right. All right, there. Calm down. You've had too much to drink.
I used to think that John Hurt, in my head when I fantasy booked it, I always thought John Hurt would do Judge Death's voice. Obviously, he's not around. He's not with us anymore. But Andy Serkis seems to have the monopoly on CGI leading characters. Like he'd obviously be played by. Is it Doug Jones?
Yeah, Doug Jones. Yeah, he does.
Yeah. The body actor would be Doug Jones, and Andy Serkis would do the voice, I reckon.
Yeah, I would add two things to that. Firstly, the concept that with so many actors sadly passing away as we go, and obviously new ones have come along, but I feel like at some point you might be like, we want it to sound like John Hurt. John Hurt sadly has passed away, so why don't we just get someone to do a John Hurt impersonation?
Yeah.
So why not do that? You can do. And secondly, Doug Jones would be awesome, obviously, but
he could be the model for all the Dark Judges, wouldn't he?
Depends on where you go with it in terms of the CGI, VFX, special effects on set, blah 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 side of things. Like he's an incredibly I think probably when you look at his frame and stuff, I'm pretty certain if you look at him, he feels like he's got his trousers pulled up too far and things like that. So he's got quite a warped body, so you'd probably end up doing something possibly CGI or whatever anyway, unfortunately. And I say unfortunately because obviously there's a lot of it you could do on set. And so I've just gone down to look at the other three judges, which you probably introduce in a second, and look at the way their frames are. But if you look at Judge Mortis, they've got that kind of, I always remember the trousers are always pulled up like they're old men type thing. So
yeah, I think it's because he's they're just skin and bone, aren't they? So
yeah, There is a literal reason. I mean, it's a dead body essentially, isn't it? And that's, I guess, is what happens.
Yeah.
So, but if you were to do that on set, how easy that is. I mean, probably, yes, Doug Jones, or whatever, someone who's got that frame where there's possibly barely nothing to them, and you can just fill it out. So, yeah.
So in the story, the fella that broke Anderson out and has got Judge Death swimming around in his head, he goes back home and finds his wife dead. So this is probably the darkest bit in the whole strip, I think, here. So he runs in, finds her dead, and then you can see that there's someone else in the room with him, but you don't see who it is. And he says, you promised you wouldn't kill her if I helped you. And then it just says, we lied, or whatever the voice is supposed to sound like.
It's Troy. That's it. That's what everyone's going to hear.
And then you see the other three Dark Judges for the first time. This is their introduction. So it's Fear, Fire, and Mortis, and they look awesome.
That's the thing, the design of these. I don't know if you know much about what process they went through or anything like that, but the actual design is pretty iconic. I guess in some ways for all four of them. Maybe I always look at Judge Fire and think of what's his name, the Nicolas Cage. In fact, interestingly, design-wise, I always think he's the slightly weakest one. Also because he's got that silly trident, which always looks a bit silly to me. But Mortis,
I always kind of liked
Judge Fear.
Fire. Like to me, like because I always kind of like an underdog, I guess. Fear looks awesome because he looks a little bit like Darth Vader, and he's got that the I don't know what you would class his helmet as. It's almost like I don't know, it's like the Black Knight or something, and then he's got these wings coming out of it. It just looks awesome.
He's not Batman, is he? Is he played by Robert Pattinson? So
yeah, could be.
Yeah.
So you heard it here first. Robert Pattinson is Judge Fear, and he's the only one that's got a cape as well. So he looks different, completely different to the others, and he looks really cool. And if you notice, his shoulder pads are actually bear traps.
Yeah.
And then Mortis is terrifying, and the older I get, the more terrified I am of Mortis. But as a kid, I always thought, he's got a cow's head. That's silly. And I always thought that Fire was pretty cool. And I liked the trident because it gives him a little bit of artillery. He's like he's their ranged weaponry.
Yeah.
But it also doesn't make sense. Like, why is his uniform still intact if he's on fire?
Yeah, exactly. Boy, that's supernatural nonsense, really, isn't it? But
it's supernatural fire. It doesn't work the same as normal fire.
I was also just going to say, just Brian Bolland's image is amazing. I mean, just looking like Judge Mortis's belt, and just like the way he's drawn it, it's just rim light. It's basically just lit almost from above. The kind of thing. So it just really picks it out. Just looks amazing. One thing I was going to ask is, do you know why they are dressed the same as normal judges? It's not.
Yeah. So the backstory, I don't know the full backstory because there's been so many stories written now that they've done the backstory for all of them. There was a young death story. So his real name is Sidney, and his dad was a dentist. And then he became Judge Death later on. They're from an alternate dimension, so it's like Mega City 1 in a different dimension.
So it is an alternate. Right? Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, and they were judges in their world, and just like Judge Dredd and Judge Anderson are in this story. But then they decided that they worked out that all crime is committed by the living, so they outlawed life and made that a crime. So they just murdered everyone, and they became these demonic wraiths or whatever they are. And each of them later on has been given like a retconned backstory as in the Dead World strips, which I haven't actually personally read. I haven't got around to reading those yet.
Lazy.
They go in into a bit more detail. Like, I understand that the reason Fire is on fire was because he went insane out of unrequited love. Like, he was in love with somebody and she never returned his love, and it drove him insane. He was already a little bit Fruit Loop to begin with, and so the reason his demonic personification is like the embodiment of just burning rage and emotion.
Right.
So I think Fear, Judge Fear, he was probably, his past self, he was probably riddled with anxiety or something like that. Judge Death, let's say he's got daddy issues and his dad was a dentist. Maybe that's why he's just got big teeth. I don't know. But yeah, so their backstories have been retconned.
Right. Okay.
But yeah, the dead world was once like a mega city, like Mega City 1, and as we'll see later in this, it's just like a hellacious hell, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, so just we'll skim through the story a little bit. So basically, Judge literally mortifies this bloke. He turns him into like a rotting corpse, and then they fill him with what they call dead fluids. And then Judge Death's ghost kind of occupies the body, and they get a uniform from somewhere. Don't know where they got the uniform from. And then his full physical self, Judge Death, and they've got this dimension, this disc ball that is a dimension jump device, so that they can basically jump from dimension to dimension. But they also use it to put a force shield around the tower block that they're in, and then they just go on a killing spree and start killing people. And then Judge Dredd turns up to save the day. And that's when we get just the best 2-page spread ever in comic books, which I'm sure you can put up on the screen, which is the 4 Dark Judges standing next to each other, which is actually my Facebook background. It seemed appropriate during COVID times to put that up there. It just seems quite representative of the of 2020, having the 4 Dark Judges there, and it's one of the best images. Like, I would have that on my wall if I could, as it is, not in colour either, in black and white. It looks amazing.
It works. I mean, it is an amazing image. Yeah. And again, just like Brian Bolland's style of the way he does stuff, it kind of plays as well. I mean, like, obviously, this does play on the whole kind of Four Horsemen-esque type thing, and it's I wouldn't say it's great to see, but it's, you know, like, you have each one killing so and so in their own unique, different way. Yeah.
And so Fear has got, like, he opens his helmet up and he says, "Gaze into the face of fear."
Yeah.
And the person just dies petrified. I think in later stories they explain that as you're seeing the embodiment of your greatest fears in his face, and you die from fear and anxiety or heart attack or whatever.
It's interesting because you do. I mean, we'll probably talk about it at some point if you was able to do some film adaptation. And I think you've mentioned before that. But Fear, you do actually see. It's almost like you're looking into the universe. There's like stars or something in there.
Yeah.
But he's hiding it as well, which is quite interesting. It's quite good. I guess that's the whole thing. It's like hiding behind your hands and what you see.
Yeah.
Careful.
So they're going on this killing spree, and Dredd's outside, and they can't get into the building. And then Judge Anderson rocks up, and it's interesting. I wanted to touch on this because the character of Judge Anderson in the 2012 film with Carl Urban, where she's played by Olivia Thirlby. Did I say that right?
I'm not too sure, but I'm sure someone would tell us if it's wrong.
Yeah. If we make mistakes, we'll blame it on the alcohol, but you can obviously tell us we're wrong in the comments, because that's what YouTube's for, right?
And then we'll just blame it on the alcohol again.
Yeah. Or
Pick a fight.
Yeah. We'll blame it on the liberals. That's what everyone does on YouTube.
Yeah, exactly.
So the character in the comic book, she's very glib and sassy and sexy and sarcastic, and she rocks up, like in the first story when you see her, she just rocks up and she's like, "Hey, Dreddy baby," and it's like nobody talks to him like that, but she does, and she gets away with it because she's Judge Anderson. So she's a totally different character in the comic books to how she was depicted in the film. And so it's a shame that we never got a sequel, because we might have seen more of that kind of sassy, light-hearted side of her as the movies developed.
Who knows? Who knows what will happen?
But I thought it was cool. So she finds what she can use her, because she's a psi judge, so she's a telepath, and she can get through this force shield. And there's a panel here that just made me chuckle when I was reading it, because she basically grabs hold of Dredd and she's like, "Hang on tight, I'll get you through." And Dredd's sort of looking at her, and his hands like that, like hovering on her lower back. It's like he doesn't even want to touch her, and she's just like hugging on tight to him.
I'm trying to get to the frame. If I remember right, there's almost like movement lines.
Yeah.
Like the hand is going down.
Yeah.
It's just like inappropriate. So.
Yeah. And you just know that Dredd's, because of the character of him, he's such a stickler for the rules, and he's so like deadpan and stoic that's just inappropriate contact between judges. That goes against. He's totally out of his comfort zone there. It just made me laugh. It was a really good bit of artwork.
Again, I mean, story-wise, that kind of thing is, you put two different types of people together, it's much more interesting.
Yeah.
Type thing, and they play off each other. It's good. But it's a great bit of artwork there. Like his face, you know, it's like the iconic kind of downward turn of his like, or whatever.
Yeah. And like the sort of the dynamic between the two is like, he's always massively irritated by her, but he tolerates her out of respect because she's so damn good at what she does.
Yeah.
He kind of begrudgingly puts up with her. And it's interesting because after there was a couple more stories with her, and then John Wagner and Alan Grant went their separate ways as they discontinued their writing partnership, and they split the characters up. So Alan Grant took Strontium Dog. So it was Alan Grant that created Durham Red, not John Wagner. Right. So if you're not familiar with that, Durham Red is a mutant bounty hunter, and her mutation is vampirism, and that's relevant to us because there's a project that we're working on that involves a female vampire that Danny will be playing. So when Alan Grant took on Judge Anderson, he took they kind of split Anderson away from Dredd for a while, and she had her own ongoing series, and Alan Grant took her on a really, really, like, she's my favourite character probably in all of comics because of the way she was written by Alan Grant. He made her not just sexy and sassy, but he made her interesting and deep, and she felt like a real woman. It wasn't just like a sexy chick with a man's mind. She was, she had a real feminine energy to her, and she's got a really interesting backstory that he wrote later on, where she's actually she was taken in by a justice department and trained to be a psi judge because she was discovered as a small child to have these psychic powers, which only came about because she was being abused by her dad. Like, as a small child, she was being raped by her dad, basically. He would wear a mask and go in and abuse her, and she'd be like, "I'll tell my daddy about you," because she thought it was a monster, and he said, "You won't say anything to anyone." And then one day she wished the monster dead and found her dad dead. Right. As a child, she didn't know. And then what Justice Department did was they wiped her mind. Right. They kind of installed a psi block in there so that she couldn't remember that. And then in a later story, she gets all those memories back, and then she goes into a deep psychosis. She basically gets PTSD from it, and then she's trapped inside her own head, and she has to basically save herself to bring herself back. It's really deep, but it's extremely well written, and that's why Alan Grant, alongside John Wagner, is one of my all-time favourite writers.
cool.
And that's just an example of how the comics evolved and became more, more than this kind of glib, light-hearted sort of take on things.
I mean, that's the thing with this kind of stuff is, especially with 2000 AD and all this kind of stuff is, if some of it is ripe for being turned into TV. I'd sit and watch, this. I'd sit and watch this. Can you imagine this episode in a Judge Dredd? I mean, that's going to be the thing you're sitting there waiting for. Episode, I'm thinking Game of Thrones. So it was always episode 9, I think. It was always episode 9 when you had the big battle of some description, and you could just imagine this would be the episode where it'd just be like fighting the Dark Judges and it being awesome and not a bit shit like the end of Game of Thrones. But anyway, but the story, like you say, the story's in there, and the amount of content and depth to this stuff is, it's brilliant. Even something like this, like you say, has got is a little frivolous in places and a little, but at the same time, it's still like, this would be still just like a quite amazing episode. I mean, like, just again, scrolling down, looking at some of the images and looking at, the piles of bodies and stuff, whilst the Dark Judges are, going around killing everybody and going crazy. So so I mean, skipping forward a little bit, we get obviously the single greatest comic book panel in the history of comic books, because we said earlier that Judge Fear opens his helmet up and says, "Gaze into the face of fear." He does that to Judge Dredd, and then Judge Dredd, his response is, "Gaze into the fist of dread," and just punches through his head, which is just classic Dredd, and which is kind of a knobhead thing to do as well, because you've got this really cool character and they've just completely taken the steam out of his, or the wind out of his sails, and they've just, it's the they've just crushed the character, really. Yeah, totally.
It's the wrestling equivalent or the comic book equivalent of a squash match in wrestling.
This was also the bit I mentioned going back just about Lord of the Rings. So if you actually read not what's said, but the text, the whole the shock of this gaze can kill an ordinary man, but Dredd is a judge, and judges are not ordinary men. Just reminds me of the end of Lord of the Rings, where I can't remember her name, the female character is, the big baddie says, no man can kill me, type thing, and she's just like, takes the helmet off and just says, "I'm no man," and stabs him, and that's it. Stabs him in the helmet face, as if that's a phrase I'm allowed to use on YouTube, and it's pretty much this, kind of thing.
That's a good parallel, actually. So we'll skip forward a little bit. So eventually they end up in Deadworld. They get Anderson and Dredd find the dimension jump, and then they follow the Dark Judges back to their own dimension, and then we're in Deadworld, and we get this awesome. Like, I think that page there, again, I would love to own that, where they do the leap and then they end up in Deadworld. You've got the Deadworld equivalent of the Hall of Justice, which is just like this. It's almost like the Dark Tower or something like that.
Yeah.
And there's just bones everywhere. The floor, you can't see the floor for bones. And then Judge Anderson just freaks out because all she can hear are the screaming, suffering souls of the dead, murdered citizens. So she has a little bit of a meltdown because she's a Psy and she's struggling to deal with all that.
Which obviously we'll get to it at the end, but that precursors. That is a probably one of the more subtle ways of doing exposition.
Yeah.
In some respects, because they're setting up this notion that she can obviously hear all these people who've been killed by the Dark Judges, and then, well, spoilers coming up.
Yeah. Yeah. So they incapacitate Dredd, and then they kind of take down Anderson psionically, and she's in pain, physical and mental and emotional pain, and she's clawing at the bones on the floor, and then she just kind of channels all the souls, all their anger and their pain, and turns it back on Dark Judges, and apparently destroys them. The end, and they live happily ever after.
Hooray. Yeah. It's good as well that I suppose, especially Anderson's character is the one who saves everything, does everything. Yeah. Dredd, if it was left down to Dredd, unfortunately, he's too busy pulling.
If it was down to Dredd, he would have nuked them.
Yeah.
He would have probably nuked the block. He'd have just pressed the button and nuked everyone. That's kind of his thing.
Yeah, true.
But yeah, no, you're right. It's like he wouldn't have been able to beat them on his own. He needed Anderson, and yeah, I just like the end. It sort of ends on a little bit of a cheesy punchline, doesn't it? She's like, after all this, I think I'll put in for that sick leave, and then Dredd's like, after this, I think I'll join you, and I'm like, I'd like to join Anderson on sick leave.
Yeah, inappropriate content coming up, no doubt. But no, you're right. I mean,
he's taken a vow of celibacy because he's a judge.
Yeah. That's yeah. But you're right in saying that basically, I think if anything, it's not like it's the weakest part of it, but and I always think this with endings. Endings tend to be weak. Very rarely a good you normally love the first half of a movie, the build up, not knowing what's going on, everything like that, and then getting a good ending is really difficult. Now I think they get a good ending, like the resolution of this, but yeah, that brings it tonally back.
Yeah.
Out of it, and it's. I'm trying to remember exactly what's in it, but it reminds me obviously of Brian Bolland's work of
Killing Joke.
Yeah, Killing Joke. Just the way that ends, and the kind of having that kind of downplayed tone to an ending. It's that is a little bit of a Stallone moment, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah.
I'm not slagging it off so much because hey, they kind of earned it in a way, and that's the thing is you can earn it like a good Arnie movie. You earn that moment at the end to say something really silly. I recently watched The Sixth Day, and that's a film in which they don't earn any moments whatsoever. So at the end of it, it's just like, oh, for fuck's sake, go away. So.
Yeah. That's a fair point, and I think tonally, because like we said at the beginning, because of the audience that it was aimed for at the time, and also because of their background. Like John Wagner used to work with Pat Mills and Jerry Finley Day. Jerry Finley Day, who is known for writing and creating Road Trooper in 2000 AD, but he wrote a lot of the great early British action comic stories, stuff like Major Easy and Rat Pack and all that kind of stuff in battle. And back then, in the anthology comics, like stories would be 3 or 4 pages at most, and there'd always be a one-off. So they had to tell a whole story with lots of action in it in 4 pages, sometimes less, sometimes 1 or 2 pages. And so they became very good at this concise style of storytelling, and that is still apparent in these early progs. And it wasn't until later on that you started to get the more sort of long form storytelling and the slow burn character development and real arc in stories. And then John Wagner, probably in the late 80s, early 90s, became really good at doing like these almost like police procedural style dramas rather than action comics. So the writing style is adapted and evolved and become very, very good. And it's a shame that John Wagner really has only ever worked, and Alan Grant, but John Wagner has only ever really worked. He's done some stuff for DC and Dark Horse, I think. But because he's never had a Watchmen or a Batman or, a preacher or something like that. He's not really talked about in America, or Sandman, you know, like Neil Gaiman. So he, to me, John Magnus should be up there with the likes of Frank Miller and Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman when it comes to, you know, when they're talking about the royalty of comic book writers. But he across the pond, they don't even know who he is, because nobody reads 2000 AD in America, because they've got Marvel and DC and all their superheroes.
I guess, yeah. I mean, I guess there must be people who do.
Yeah,
People who know.
I mean, there is,
but you're right. The people who don't know as such, and you know,
most people know Dredd from the Stallone movie, or maybe the 2012 movie with Carl Urban. Most people don't know Dredd from the comics.
Yeah, I don't doubt that. And possibly in some ways that could be true with a lot of things now. I mean, like, you know, we've got new generations now, and they would possibly know it from. I don't doubt a lot of kids have probably seen the Stallone one, because it was a 12 or a PG maybe, or something like that. So that would potentially be their first introduction to it, sadly.
Yeah, and that is sad, because you'd watch that film, it's a piece of shit, and then you go and read the comics and they're amazing. You're like, this isn't Judge Dredd.
That's sometimes the way it works, though. I mean, maybe that's a good thing in some ways, but yeah, actually, it's probably not. So, yeah, I recant that earlier statement of it being a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, it works both ways. So if you watch the film and then read a Dredd comic, you'll be surprised by the difference. If you've read Dredd comics and then you watch the film, you'll just be massively disappointed by the representation. I found the same thing with Lock and Key. I read the Joe Hill story, the graphic novel series, and it's one of the best things I've ever read in comics. And then I watched the first 2 or 3 episodes in the Netflix series, and I was like, this is bollocks.
Yeah.
Nothing like it. They've changed all the characters' motivations, and it's like, you know, there's a few story pieces in it that are, you know, plot pieces in it that are kind of the same, but they've just changed it so much. It's just, and it's not even, at least with the boys, like, they changed the boys a little bit from the comic books, but it still works really well in its own right.
I thought the boys was brilliant. So,
yeah,
and I think it comes out tomorrow. The second season is tomorrow.
Right. Okay.
So, the only thing I'd say, and to finish up in terms of slagging off poor old Stallone, is because he's probably watching this crying into his piles of money, is if you're ever doing anything creative or anything really, sometimes it's really good to do it very wrong in the first place, and you learn so much from that. So I kind of always look at the first film as being, pretty dreadful. I have to admit, I've watched it a few times where I've just put it on and it's been on and you just fall asleep to it. It doesn't matter. There's some good stuff potentially in there. There's plenty of stuff that's horrible. Rob Schneider's character. It's just, exactly. But brilliant. Do that really wrong. Do it terribly. And then whoever comes after it will look at it and say, whatever we're going to do, we're not going to do that. But I'll tell you what, Mean Machine and the whole Angel Gang thing was potentially quite interesting. Yeah. The look of it.
They were in it for 5 minutes. That should have been the film. If they were going to have them in it and them be as good as they were in the film, that should have been the film. Dredd going out into the cursed earth to arrest the Angel Gang.
Unfortunately, if you're a 90s or whatever it was, coked up Hollywood exec, that's not what your audience is telling you in your head.
And the incredibly camp uniform designed by Versace.
Exactly.
With the cod piece.
I have to say,
fucking cod piece all about?
Yes, yeah. I have to say though, Diane Lane rocks. Yeah. Diane Lane rocks. So I always like a bit of Diane Lane. So that was the one kiss that's just like, no, don't do that. Oh, okay. Well, don't do that. Oh, okay. So.
But don't do it with him.
Yeah.
Okay, so while we're on the subject of films, and we kind of sort of fantasy cast the film just now, seeing as VFX is your thing,
Yep.
and are we allowed to talk about your current project?
No.
Are we allowed to mention that or not?
No.
You're not allowed to mention it. Okay.
You can mention stuff I've done in the past, but you can't talk about what I'm doing at the moment.
What about the one before that you finished just before the current one? Are you allowed to mention that yet?
Possibly, yeah, because it is on IMDb.
Can you even mention the actor's name?
Yeah. Well, basically, and I'm either going to go to jail for mentioning this or not. But no. So basically, my role, I'm what's called a nuke compositor. So I work in the VFX industry, and basically put together and work on high, mid-level, I guess, TV. So I've done stuff like The Crown and various other things, even some cheesy stuff like Strike Back, if anyone's ever seen that on Sky and that. Recently been working on a Tom Hanks movie.
That was the name I wanted to drop. I was just
Right, okay.
trying to build you up.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'll get there eventually. Like Tom Hanks, we eventually get there. You know, it takes us a while. So, so I'd sort of work in terms of a lot of what we'd call hidden VFX. So we do a lot of stuff, and you know, most of anything that's shot nowadays is in front of green screens and blue screens and stuff, and various projects where people are in, driving around and they've never left the studio lot type thing, as you probably know. And then obviously do a lot of stuff that's more visible VFX. This obviously, if we were to fantasize, I want to say fantasize. If we want to think about how you would approach to do this as a film, which is or a TV series especially, is that how you do this kind of thing. There's lots of.
So sorry, just to interrupt, but you say TV series because there is allegedly a TV Dredd TV series.
Rebellion, I think, are working.
Sorry?
Rebellion.
Yeah,
Rebellion,
who published 2000 AD, have started a movie studio. They've just announced their first film, actually, haven't they?
Yeah, in fact, that's a good friend of mine. A director called Haz is actually directing it, and also the cinematographer is a friend of mine as well, a guy called Eben. Right. So there's actually shooting that in, from what I understand, the manner in which you, rather than shooting green screens and stuff, you have big projector screens, which are showing the background essentially, and you shoot that, and you get all the lighting that goes with it, all this kind of stuff. It's very interesting way. Oblivion was a very good example of that. All the stuff where Tom Cruise, if you remember right, is up in the station, whatever it is, the base. And all that, there's loads of stuff on YouTube and things you can see of this stuff. But what you get is the background, you get all the sky, you get all the lighting information for free, which is always a difficult thing to try and replicate. Especially, for instance, if, for example, if you was to do Judge Fire, how would you do that on set? How would you actually achieve that? And more importantly, how would you achieve the fact he's on fire and casting the reflections and the ambience of fire all over the set and various people and all that sort of stuff? So that's normally when you watch this stuff and you see it on TV, this kind of thing, and it's just like, it's the integration of that element within the frame and how it's casting light, especially onto other objects. So, and
isn't there a fiery character in one of the Lord of the Rings films?
What's that? Sorry.
Isn't there a fiery character in one of the Lord of the Rings films?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Oh, the Burrow. Yes. Now, but what's probably good about him is that he is massive, and pretty much all that, except for the little Gandalfs and everybody else, are little green screen people, and you just change, you add a little color on them that's kind of flickering, and you'll probably get away with it. If you had, for instance, if you was to take the iconic shot of the four of them standing next to each other, so the dark judges standing next to each other, and do that, then the fall off of light onto the two dark judges either side of him would be something about how, you'd have to consider that. And there'd be various different ways that you do it. We could get very technical here if you wanted to, but basically, especially with that, you probably in principle don't want to be setting anybody on light on film unless you can completely control that. And I'd say in that instance, you wouldn't be able to control it at all. So you would be, you'd either go down the road, and probably the cheaper way possibly to do it, and the easier way, and to get the best result, is that you'd probably make your other characters CG, or elements of them, most of them CG, so that you can then control how that light flickers on them and changes them. So, but it would all depend on, the amount of money you've got and what you're trying to do. Having said that, with COVID, everyone's 2 meters apart now, so maybe it doesn't matter. See, this could be a massive game changer, actually. It's just like...
And that's going to be your career for the next sort of 3 or 4 years, is using CGI to bring people closer.
In all seriousness, possibly yes. I mean, like when this all kicked off, it was one thought, and I don't doubt. So I don't doubt that's going to be something that's going to, is going to come up in films and how you do stuff. We'll see. Yeah.
So so you mentioned Judge Fire, and we talked a little bit earlier about sort of death and maybe using sort of Doug Jones as a body, or someone like him would be sort of like the body model or figure or actor, whatever the term is. How do you think of we've talked before on here about a company called Bloody Cuts, who are known for their monster creation. So in my mind, I'm thinking like, well, if you were to do a film of this story, Judge Death Lives, it would probably be directed by Guillermo del Toro. It would have Doug Jones in it as probably the 4 dark judges. Would Bloody Cuts do the special effects or the creature creations?
Well, no, they wouldn't, just because Bloody Cuts mainly do short films, so they're not quite. Their work is absolutely amazing, and they kind of embody that style of on-set special effects. So there's a difference. Visual effects tends to be in the computer. Special effects is your on-set physical kind of makeup, etc., etc. So the Thing that everyone talks about, the Thing, the original John Carpenter Thing, special effects. The remake is now is hybrid effects, which is a combination of the two. And nowadays there's a lot of this kind of thing. So when everybody moans about too much visual effects, what they're sometimes not seeing is the hybrid effects, where it's a kind of combination of both. What was your question again? Sorry, I'm distracted. I was just coughing.
Do you think that Bloody Cuts would do a...
Right, yeah.
Do you think they would do a really good Judge Death?
Yeah, I don't doubt. I mean, like, from that point of view, I honestly think with this kind of thing is... if you had the amount of money, you could get people who do a very good job. Now, obviously, there is, you know, people who do not such a good job, and they might be the same amount of money. But someone like them, you know, if you go and watch their films, they have a very good style and sense of what works and what doesn't. So I think there'd definitely be that kind of thing. That kind of for instance, the company that did do the remake of the thing and did the special effects, who are ADI, if I remember right, and it'll flash up if I'm wrong, but they, for instance, did a film after the fact to show off their kind of their special effects and doing everything on set. And that you can download and find that again. That'll be, you know, flashing up now, no doubt. And that kind of quality of special effects and doing stuff on set, if you can get that, and then you get everything kind of for free, so you get the whole integration, you get the whole stuff that when it's visual effects and you don't have enough money to do it and you don't have enough time to do it, and it's not very good, for want of a better phrase, or it's not as good as it could be, or it doesn't integrate, then that's the kind of thing that you do. Having said that, I think, so for instance, Judge Mortis would be an interesting, it's like, how would you do that? How would you do him on set? He would be, to me, a hybrid VFX. So you'd probably have someone potentially with the whole helmet, etc., like that, but then a VFX team would remove all the stuff that shouldn't be there, and then it then becomes the skull, and it becomes kind of thing. So that's, I mean, just looking at them, Judge Fire is someone in a suit, and then you'd add maybe the fire afterwards. Judge Mortis, to be honest, aside from what's inside his head, he's probably just a guy in a suit. Judge Death is potentially a guy in a suit, but a very specifically, like, again, he's just amazing. I'm just looking at one of the images here of him, and just like his trousers are just crazy. And then, Judge Mortis is I think he would be the most challenging one, to be honest, because he's potentially got a lot of stuff missing around the face, and then you'd have to kind of track in and remove so and so sort of thing. That is to assume that, you know, like if you're doing it for a film, there's, you know, it's higher quality. If you're doing it for TV, nowadays it's just as good quality, but maybe not. You know, sometimes things get, you know, you just run out of money.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that in stuff like Stranger Things, where in the first series there was a lot of practical effects, and in the second series there was a lot more CGI, and it just... Is there 3 seasons of that?
3 seasons, isn't it? 4th is coming out.
Yeah, so...
First season is brilliant.
The third season, there was even more visual effects, and it kind of... I feel it detracted from... Like, the first series is... Because the third series is basically a comedy. The first series is a horror. And then, like, the second one's more of an action movie kind of thing. But the more CGI they introduced, the less... I don't know, the less tangible it felt, and it felt like the cheaper the VFX were looking compared with the first series, where it was mostly practical effects with a bit of CGI. I don't know if you agree or disagree with that, but
it's not that I agree or disagree. I kind of agree with the concept of what you said. I think anything like this is it's the nature of the beast, really. If you if your director, and not blaming anyone, but if your director decides that they want the camera to swing around and do crazy stuff, and 5,000 demogorgons to run out of the woods and fire fireballs out of their arse at people, then that's going to cost a shitload of money. If your clever and you build up your stuff and do it well, then it, it doesn't. You can get away with more. It's about using stuff cleverly. I mean, like, I always think the thing that maybe sometimes is not said about John Carpenter's The Thing versus the remake is that John Carpenter kind of knew his limitations. He pushed his limitations. I mean, he drove Rob Bottin to, to hospital pretty much.
Well, yeah,
and that.
In hospital for a week after with like chronic fatigue and exhaustion.
Yeah. But he knew how to shoot it, and Dean Cundy, I think I'm pretty sure it was the cinematographer. He knew how to shoot the stuff. So everything's in shadow. Everything's well, not everything's in shadow because you do actually see a shitload actually, but it's very well done. It's very just like they know what to show and they know what to try and hide. I think the biggest thing with the remake is that the prequel even is that they try and do stuff which is a little bit like it's either going to work or it's not, and you're showing a lot and like when the creature's running around, the thing's running around, it's kind of if you don't get it right, it's not going to work. You're going to show so much. So, hey, that's always to me the problem. And in some ways, so like looking at this, I'm just looking at the comic book here. The advantage with it's a drawn comic. You see everything. You kind of see everything that they want to show and everything. You can do whatever you want, and that's the thing with going to film and TV is that all of a sudden you've kind of got to try and achieve little miracles, and so that's the state of things. That's why I don't particularly like this kind of VFX is shit. I get why people say that, but at the same time, it's just as an artist myself at the end, it's just like it's a little bit sort of like.
Yeah, no, I wasn't implying that VFX is shit.
It was.
I was using Stranger Things as an example of because you said like they'll have a certain budget in a film and they'll have less of a budget in TV shows, and so the VFX won't be quite as high grade. And that was the example that sprung to my mind. Is like the more VFX they used in Stranger Things, the kind of cheaper it looked. And then so I said about the Transformers movie. So it was quite early in, by today's standards, that's quite early VFX, I assume. But there was still, it's pretty. The special effects in that VFX were pretty spectacular at the time when they came out. But there were obviously limitations there, and if you notice in all the action sequences, you can't really see what's going on. It's all a blur. Was that on purpose? Did they film it that way to hide the limitations?
No, well, I think that's a perfect example of, and no offense to Michael Bay, but I'm not a massive fan.
No,
that way. I think that's a perfect example of just what like an artistic sensibility of just like, because the market for it is young boys, 12-year-old boys or whatever, and they've obviously taken their dads with them, so that's why you've got hot girls in there to keep them happy, and then the rest of it is just nonsense.
I still remember going to see the second Transformers movie, and the first shot of Megan Fox, she's wearing these tiny denim hot pants and she's draped over this motorcycle, and the camera just pans up and it's a blatant extreme close-up arse shot, and then it just sort of pulls out and you see her and she's draped really sexually over this motorcycle, and every man in the cinema just went, oh, and then you heard because the girlfriend hit him afterwards.
Yeah, too right.
And it was just blatantly there for the blokes. And that's the only reason the blokes went to see it was to get the Megan Fox shot.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. And well, maybe, don't know. I don't even want to justify Michael Bay because I think he's. Yeah, I think he's.
Yeah. And
he's
you know,
everything wrong
between him and Megan Fox is fairly well documented. I don't think he treated it extremely well. So
no, and I don't think he's a perfect example of kind of misogyny within filmmaking and stuff like that. Now, sometimes I'm not going to justify it at all. Sometimes terrible people produce great things. That's the unfortunate thing. I'm going to use the example of Sam Peckinpah, who was a dreadful man, but who produced some great work. I mean, I always think Cross of Iron is just like one of the most amazing war films, if not one of the best war films in the world because of its slant. He also was a terrible man, a terrible misogynist, a terrible. I dread to think what else he probably was.
What Kubrick did to what's her name in The Shining?
Exactly.
Sally
Duvall, and how much of that was misogyny, how much of that was him trying to get the perfect shot, how much of that was all this kind of stuff is always probably open to conjecture depending on what slant you ever come from. At the same time, it's kind of thing. I think that's the thing. I think the thing with Michael Bay, not wanting to slag Michael Bay off. I mean, I don't know why we're slagging Michael Bay off. Now we've got into this, but
it's safe to say that we don't want Michael Bay to direct our Judge Death movie.
No, I hope not. We've probably totally jinxed it now.
Yeah. Oh God, could you imagine a Michael Bay Judge Dredd movie or Judge Death movie? That would be awful. Okay, I think we can wrap it up there. We've been waffling on for long enough, haven't we?
I don't know. What day is it now? So, how many of your?
What year?
Just out of interest, how much was your beer?
Because it's an import and because it's extra strong, it actually cost me. I think it was £10.40 for a can of beer.
£10.40. That's what Brexit does.
It's a good display of flour on it, but it was delicious. It was well worth the price.
Yeah. And
the American stuff is really dear over here. The really good American craft beers, because of the import charges and what have you, they're really dear over here. Like if that was made, if there was an equivalent of that made in an English brewery, it'd still be expensive, but it would be like £5 or £6 a can rather than £10 a can.
Yeah. And sorry, how many cans are you hoping that they're going to send you for free? Sorry.
As many as they can afford. So Equilibrium Brewery, if you're watching this, I'll have a million cans of Vulgar Display of Flour, please.
Okay. Cool.
Right. Okay. We're Sweet Nightmares. This has been a view from the bar. That has actually gone to my head just a little bit, and we'll be back soon with another video and some more chit chat and some crap.
Cool.
If anything we've said today has annoyed you or triggered you, please tell us we're idiots in the comments, because even the negative comments will bump us up in the algorithm. It's all good. And like I say, that's what YouTube's for. It's what the internet's for. Tell people why you think they're wrong rather than doing anything productive with your time.
Yeah. And we can always block you anyway, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's that as well. So, Cool. All right.
Cool.
We'll be back soon. Laters.
Take care. Bye.